welcome everyone. Welcome to the participants of the program, Cohort 9. Welcome to the graduates from the program. Great to see you. And the last session of the month, usually we have an open class, and in the open class, we usually have demonstrations. But today we're going to do something different. Instead of having a demonstration, we are going to have a webinar on intercultural issues and cultural issues. I do believe as coaches, we need to pay attention in language, how communication plays, what are the similarities and differences that we may have with our clients, and how that may be supporting our work or being our way. So the goal that we have today is to bring higher level of awareness about how cultural issues may be affecting the work that we do and the conversations we're having with our clients, but with everybody. So just to bring higher level of awareness to it. And I don't think there is enough work we can do about it. I think that it doesn't matter how much training you have and how much work you have done around these topics. I think that it's something that we all need to keep paying attention to and keep enhancing and working and going to the next level wherever we are. So we're happy, I'm very happy that Cookie and Naguesh accepted my invitation. They have done that in the past for the program. They are both interculturalists, and maybe they can explain exactly what that means. And what we like to say, both of you graduated from our program, have been coaches from other classes. You have been engaged for a couple of years with this community. And what would you like people to know about you? And Cookie is also going to be coaching a couple of people from the program. So would you like to start? Saying a couple of things about you, what would you like people to know?
Cookie, how about you?
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank Damien because the program that I did with him was in the middle of COVID, and it took a space to be able to transform the way I was working. So thank you, and again, thank you again for inviting us to do this. I've known Naguesh for many years, and it's a pleasure to be able to work with him. Damian said we have to say one thing about the other person. So Naguesh is a master of games and t-shirts, and he can explain that. So just in general, I'm what is known as the third culture kid. So I've worked and lived around the world globally. Presently, right now, I'm in Southern California. Tomorrow on my way up to San Francisco. Yet I grew up in Peru, and yet I'm moving to Lisbon, to Portugal. So, and I'm very happy that our friends are here and people we've worked with and done programs. So thank you for being here. And Naguesh.
Thank you, Cookie. And like Cookie, thank you, Damien, for inviting us. It's through your teaching and mentorship that we have several of us here who graduated and have gone on the path to coaching. So it means a lot to us, an honor to be back sharing a few ideas. And as Cookie already said, she's being humble. I think she speaks like 72 languages, maybe not, but a lot of, how many languages, Cookie? Fluently?
Well, I speak 9, I communicate in 9, but I work in 6. So far from 72, but there's still time.
So that, yeah, so I'm honored to be working with Cookie, a friend from a long time. And as you heard, it's the language, culture, ability to bridge, and I think communicate with people from very different backgrounds, I think is fascinating. So personally, I'm originally from India, came to the US a long time ago. Currently, I teach in a medical school in Athens, Ohio. My initial interest was kind of the intersection of culture and health, but more and more, the reason you'll hear why we're talking about this culturally adaptive coaching is that, you know, we can think about differences in so many ways. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be only nationality, ethnicity, or diversity, equity, inclusion works. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Yeah. Let me just share my screen to get started. And Cookie, do you want to ask our friends by way of introduction what you would like?
So we were thinking that it would be interesting to find out where you are. So where are you located? If you want to be somewhere else, you can also say somewhere else. And then one unique characteristic about yourself, something that is important to you that you'd like to share. And we will monitor the chat as we go along. And
Thank you. So as you're beginning, okay, that's a good idea. Cookie, would you like to add our prompt to the chat?
oh, okay, yes, sorry.
Yes, please use the chat function.
Sorry.
To tell us where you are right now and one thing unique about you that would be great for us to know. Erica, like the coffee in Texas. Wonderful. Thanks, Dave. Most definitely, we should connect and talk about our interests, common interest in culture and health. Wonderful. Love the rope scores. Ooh, African Grey Parrot. Thank you so much. Please continue to do that as we'll get to know each other in multiple ways.
Eric is in a cow field in Texas. Just be careful.
Yeah,
you
I know.
encounter any Texans.
No, thank you. So as an overview, what, first to begin with, we kind of wanted to begin with the International Coaching Federation's definition of coaching that you've been introduced to, we were introduced to, and I think, we want to acknowledge the value of this definition and the importance of it in, learning to be really a stellar coach, right? To start, we're actually going to begin with an activity that may push some of us a little bit out of our boundaries and kind of begin thinking about the role of culture. And after we do that, we will get into kind of the why, what, and how of the culturally adaptive coaching. The first activity is a little bit around the how, but so as we know, and I understand for this particular cohort, you talked about this recently, is when you look at the ICF guidelines and the notion of contracting, which by itself, I think, is linguistically and culturally interesting to keep in mind. These are the 4 questions or versions of the 4 questions in terms of what would you like to focus on? Why is this important to you? What would success look like at the end of our session? Where would you like to start? Right? Extremely important, I think, in terms of the contracting. As Damien mentioned, Cookie and I, as we've been exploring this field, given our experiences, I think not only internationally, but within the US, that this particular approach works for some culture, some people, and not necessarily for other clients. So this is kind of mostly direct, linear, explicit way of, if you will, contracting. So to kind of push us out of that, we're going to do this little activity where we're going to contract without questions, right? So Damien is going to put you in pairs soon. And when you get in your pair, may I invite one of you to be the coach and one of you to be the client. Don't worry, at the end, towards the end, we're going to have another activity where you switch roles. So both of you get to play the role of the coach and the client, right? And once you decide who's going to be the coach and who's going to be the client, think of an issue that you would bring to a coaching session, right? Could be professional issues, something happening related to your coaching or at work and so on and things like that. And here's the key. The person who's playing the coach, we want you to contract or create an agreement without asking a single question, but still get answers to the 4 questions we have. And by the way, we'll put this in the chat. Right? These 4 questions we'll put in the chat so that you have it. So when you're in your pairs, We want you to contract or create an agreement without asking a single question, right? If we were in person, I would say if the other person asks a question, feel free, like my kindergarten teacher, to slap the person on the wrist. We are virtual, we can't do that. But, and get answers to the 4 questions that ICF is asking for, okay? Damien just told us we may have a little extra time. So Damien, how about we give 15 minutes for this activity instead of 10 for people to work in pairs? And Cookie, would you mind putting the 4 questions in the chat?
Okay.
Any questions? Which is kind of a strange thing to ask, given that you're going to contract without questions before we get started.
I'm getting the 4 questions. 1 second. Yeah.
So I guess I'm putting you in one room, 2 together if you want to talk. Or... Okay.
So here are the 4 ICF questions. Okay, there we go.
Okay. We can see them. So should I open the rooms?
So in your rooms, 1 coach, 1 client, the coach is going to contract or create an agreement without asking a single question and get answers to these 4 questions that ICF has as the first part of contracting. So we'll take 15 minutes, and after that, when we come back, we will debrief and talk about the activity. Thank you, Damien.
Okay.
Okay.
So there is one person that is alone. Should one of you work with it with Naguesh? Do you want to with Juan? I think that this is Cookie, your supervisor. Have you ever met her or not yet? I think that Cookie is in the.
Yeah, thank you so much. Welcome back, and thanks for your introductions. It is so wonderful to meet you from different parts of the world, and love the uniqueness in terms of what you bring. So to get us started, so I'm going to invite first those who are coaches. So using 1 word, please describe what it felt like to coach without asking questions.
And you can put that in the chat if you like.
You can put it in the chat. I would also love to hear your voice so that yeah. Who are the coaches for show of hands? Right. So tell me.
Or training, they are getting trained as coaches, or they are graduated from the program. Most people here today.
Yeah, you're welcome to unmute. So tell me what it felt like to coach without asking questions.
This is Tina. Yeah, it was hard. I had more of a pause because I wanted to ask the question, and I was trying to think how I can rephrase what I wanted to say without asking a question, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It was challenging because there was a lot of layers I wanted to peel for the onion. I was telling her at the end with questions, but I was having to pause to think, how can I how can I talk without asking the question, I guess.
No, thanks for sharing, Tina, right? And we'll get to this. I think across most cultures, we can talk about, do we ask questions a lot, right? And what role questions play, yeah? Jerry?
I think for me, it was falling back to my old training skills with reflective listening. And so not asking as many questions, but just kind of becoming that mirror of stating back what I'm hearing. Because I know where I'd want to lead the conversation, and just sort of putting that mirror there and letting the person go deeper naturally, because I'm not really directing that conversation one way or the other. I'm just kind of saying, this is what you're saying, and just kind of letting them unpeel that onion in a sense.
No, thank you so much, Jerry. I mean, in some ways, if I hear you correctly, Jerry, it's kind of going with where the client is going. So the focus is not on us asking questions all the time, right? And of course, we want to be client-centered. I just want to read out some.
And it wasn't easy.
It wasn't easy, right? Cheryl, I love it. Cheryl says, wrong, we shouldn't be doing this. Limiting, intriguing, reflective listening, right? Any other thoughts from coaches? What it felt like?
Well, I can jump in. So
Yes.
I was in the room with Megan, and she and I maybe didn't understand exactly what you were saying. So we did both. We switched. But without questions, you kind of let the other person talk and then categorize what they say in terms of the four. And then at times use paraphrasing. But I think the key to it is really presence. If you lean into it, then the other person opens up naturally. And because otherwise it can feel like an interrogation.
Thank you so much, Dave. So from the clients, who were clients by show of hands? Right. So how did you feel being coached without any questions being asked? How did you feel?
I'll dive in. This is Eric. I was with Laura, and I think there were a couple of questions that, not questions, but statements she made that were really thought-provoking and really powerful, and kind of made me sit back and go, huh, that's because, once you know the 4 or 5 questions, you kind of expect those, but you hear them a different way. You're like, wow, that really elicited something in me. And I think the other thing that I noticed and we talked about was sometimes she was struggling with how to phrase the question. And as she was trying to do that, she noticed that she lost the thread with me. And so that felt unnatural to her. So by doing something that felt different and something that didn't feel the way we're kind of trained and kind of customized to do it, it threw her off a little bit. Did I get that right?
Sorry?
I was asking if I got that right for Laura, since I was kind of speaking for her there.
That was right.
Okay. No, thank you. And in some ways, I think, Dave, like you're saying, I know we kind of forced you in kind of a literal saying, okay, get the answers to these 4 questions, right? So there's a fundamental part of saying these 4 questions, actually the questions that are relevant, important to a client from multiple perspectives or different viewpoints. Yeah. Anybody else? One more from a client. How did it feel? Like, yeah, please.
Yes, Tina was my coach, and I think she did a great job of opening and really establishing the trust, which leads to the presence. But it made me really want to talk and open up a lot more, just because I felt like she was very relatable and I could just talk to her. So I think that's really important in terms of when you have a session like this, where you're trying to just get the client to say things, is really the eye contact, the presence, and the way you open with a really friendly tone and pace in your voice.
Thank you so much, Gail. Right. So acknowledging, we're not saying don't ask questions at all in coaching, right? Acknowledging the value of questions, if you will. What are some disadvantages when we ask or when we interact with clients through questions? What are some potential disadvantages of coaching? Dave?
Yeah, so Ashley and I were talking about this earlier in the week, that when you ask a question, there's sometimes the perception that it's I think you're looking for a certain answer. In other words, a question can be interpreted as adding weight, maybe in a way that's different than the weight that the person has placed on that. So again, a question can perhaps seem leading. And then last thing I'll say is often clients want to take care of the coaches. So they try to give you the answer that they think you want.
Wonderful,
Right.
thank you.
Nice.
Is it Lorcan? Sorry.
Actually, what Dave shared was kind of what I was thinking. So yeah.
Can I
Yes,
add on the ML? I think Dave said it, but in my experience with Lorcan, I loved the silence. And I think it's because Lorcan was trying to find a different way to say it, but it helped my mind flow where I want to go. And when there's a question that's not, when my mind is going somewhere, but the question drags me somewhere else, then as Dave was just saying, I have to respond to that question, and I'll lose that that precious moment. So not asking question is not directing, and letting the client swim the space by him or herself.
No, thank you so much. We know about the power of silence, or whether we focus on the power of silence and also acknowledging the role of silence in different cultures. My father would often say that the most important part of giving a talk is the pause. Right? Where the pause comes is the key piece in their presentation. So thank you so much, Choma, because then, Dave, this is the other part, like you said, which is in the healthcare research, and I know, Lynn, you said you're an osteopath, which is fantastic, is in some ways, if you're in a profession of healthcare, if you will, the person asking the question, if you will, sets the agenda, right? And it's perfectly normal in terms of a decision tree. But I think, as Dave is reflecting, is that where the client wants to go, right? And may or may not be in terms of, and of course, we are trained to do that. But like Thomas said, how can we use pause, silence, or other ways, if you will, right?
So Naguesh, I wanted
Yeah.
to, I paired with and I would like her to share her findings, because I think it's really interesting. If I may, is my supervision coach. So it's very interesting, since I spent almost 19 years in Asia and Japan and China. I feel very much at home working with her. So if you wouldn't mind, would you like to share what we discussed, what you came up with?
Yeah, thank you, Cookie. Yeah. I'm just sharing the way I start the coaching session. So I'm using some statement. I use the verb, tell me more. Tell me one of your challenge. Tell me more. Or how do you know that you have made progress at the end of time? Or share with me more some background about this topic. That I'm thinking the way to rephrase this question, we will meet the core competency number 4, cultivate the trust and the safety. The coach, we can easier to create a safe and a supportive environment that allowed the client to share freely. Yeah. That's from me.
What I liked what you said was that it builds a sense of intimacy.
Yeah,
and
intimacy.
Then it goes into a competency of building trust, which is
If we use the ICF question, then the client feel that they are interviewed.
I think that Amy raised her hand. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We can talk about it on our next supervision session.
This goes back to something we were talking about, I believe, last time, about the 4 questions and how deep do you go when you're asking the questions as opposed to just getting the answers before diving into the work. And our conversation was really interesting because it absolutely was that we were doing the work while we were going through the questions. And Jerry did an excellent job, though, not losing track of the questions. He never asked the questions, but he always had the 4 questions. And one way or another, just kept bringing me back. And so it was this nice mix of doing the work and also making sure that we were going to get somewhere by the end. That we had it by the end of the call, we kind of identified the goal at the very end and got to the answer of the goal at the very end too. I'm curious what other people experienced about this, kind of mixing the work with the setting the work up.
Thank you so much. But Gail, may I ask you to say a little bit more when you say no time to think?
Sure, that's fine. What I mean is when there's too many questions and somebody's, continually barraging you with verbiage, it's like, I don't have time to think for myself, my own thoughts of where I wanted to go next. And I just find it like just too much noise. So I think when we were talking about the silence and the powerful pauses, that's where I was going with that.
No,
Hopefully
thank
that
you.
makes sense to you.
No, thank you, because honestly, as an international student coming here to the US, the first few social interactions for me were really, people kept asking me questions, with very good intentions to know me, but each question I felt like I'm being plastered to the wall, and I like saying, okay, right, versus kind of a more eased, if you will, conversation in the process, right? So let's take this, because we're going to kind of spend more time on this, and I'm going to put the screen back, right, in terms of the importance or value of not asking questions. Kind of went through this in terms of debrief. We would love to hear more in terms of, kind of began to talk about the strategies you used, if you will, right? And this is not the only way to do it. And I think most of you are talking about it. Sometimes one is actually, are these 4 questions are the questions that the client wants to answer? And sometimes they may not be. I find that sometimes client, if I ask in the sequence, if you will, doesn't feel like it fits. And I don't know if you read the little outline I sent. This is kind of what happened with one of my clients, a Latina, who felt like I was like, this is not what I want to focus on. I just want to share my story in terms of my struggles of being in the corporate context and how I feel unheard. And these questions really didn't evoke that. So, but if you're not asking questions, couple of ways, right? Please describe, sketch the topic, issue, opportunity you wish to explore today, right? And so why is this important to you? To clarify, it looks like keeping relationship in harmony is important to you. So rephrasing and finding out. What would make this a successful session? Cookie, you want to say a little bit about that, how it's not relevant in high context cultures, meaning where talk's not the primary focus, all the nonverbals and the other issues around it are important. Do you want to say a word about that, Cookie?
I think also, so when we talk about high context cultures, we'll talk about a little bit later. There might not be the direct communication approach, which was one of the things that made me uncomfortable when I was doing the practice, the training, is to ask a direct question. But in many cultures, there is mostly indirect. So the issue of success is a goal-oriented Western kind of an approach. So we're talking about relationships. So when is this involving a relationship, or how do you see this from another standpoint? So for example, what Ng said about challenges, not necessarily success, always success and always getting the medal. And I think that we have to look at what's behind what's being said. So we'll talk a little bit more about the direct and indirect and low context and high context cultures. And, yeah, go ahead, Naguesh.
No, Larkin's raised his hand, so yeah.
So this may be the essence of this exercise, but when I look at the without questions category there, just because there's not a question mark at the end of the statement, to me, that's asking the question. So is that a cultural difference because it's not as direct, it's more passive? Because to me, it's the same thing.
Thank you for saying that.
Yes, thank you. So that was this is a very important point, because when you're, just as several people mentioned, when you're directing the question, it's a kind of a guiding. So this is a more, I don't know about the word is passive. I mean, Naguesh probably has a better word for that, but it's a more indirect of inviting the person and not sort of attacking is also not the right approach, but setting a question in a framework, right? So you're inviting, by not asking a question, there's no direct answer. So, but you're right, it always, for some people, there is no other way than to ask a question, because that's what we're used to doing.
So yeah, I think if I could kind of echo what Cookie is saying and what you're saying, Lorcan, but because this activity, in some ways, you're right. At the end of the day, we're still kind of asking a question without asking questions. But the premise is that, first of all, these 4 questions actually is asking the question, what does it do, right? But you're right. For me, please describe may not be what would you like to address in today's session, but at the end of the day, you're asking the same kinds of things. So for me, for example, you know, Damien will laugh because we heard once in one of our sessions that, you know, of course, you have to follow the ICF guidelines, which is valuable to get your certification. And somebody said the certification is important, follow these rules. And once you get the certification, feel free to break the rules, right? But it's also the sense of saying, more and more, I begin my conversations with my clients with a very short story or self-disclosure, because the research on friendships and interpersonal relationships says that, right, each of us self-disclose. If you take the risk, the other person discloses, and then you have kind of a flow. It is, when I meet a client for the first time and I'm asking questions, and I think as somebody said, how can you ask the, you know, create a trust by asking the person to open up, be it small or big, in a way that could be, you know, pretty important, powerful, and so on. So instead of even going through these questions, but to get to the essence of a contract, right? I use narrative statements to see where they are. And it is true, I do say, like I've said in the last one, that sometimes I'd say your story involved many strands, or actually tell them what strands were, and please start with the strand that's most important to you, or ask them to explore one of the strands, right? Because it is true, at the end of the day, we do want them to focus on something that can work with, otherwise it's kind of going all over the place, right? Maybe ask what other strategies you use for any of these in terms
Naguesh,
of,
let me just add here what Amy mentioned, that when you ask questions, it sets people up to possibly get the answers wrong. So their perception might be, okay, if I don't answer this right, maybe, and then of course, what was said before also, that you set up to the question sets the coachee up to think, okay, what does the coach want me to answer? What answer is the coach looking for? So this is more of a closed question and open question kind of an approach, without putting boundaries around it.
Thank you, thank you. Other strategies or thoughts in terms of how you engage, contract, and even the complete conversation without questions? Mom?
Yeah, what I'm thinking is that with the indirect way, we still have the purpose of getting more information from the client. However, if we use the word like tell me, share with me, or I like to invite you, with this word, I think we will start the emotional part from the client rather than the thinking part.
Nice.
And from discovering the emotions, we can go to the emotional iceberg, where we can have easier to provoke the thinking.
Absolutely right. That's much more open-ended, giving, if you will, the client the space to share emotionally and otherwise in terms of what is important, right? In some ways, this notion, actually, there's a paper written about how questions, whether we like it or not, like I said, the person asking the question is setting the agenda and therefore has the power. And so when you don't ask questions, and I think Jerry was talking about it, in some ways you're kind of actually making the relationship more equal,
Right.
because you can let the conversation flow where the client actually wishes to go. Right. So if you could, in the chat, right, and I know we haven't gotten to definitions and so on, but could you share one key takeaway from this activity, and specifically about coaching and cultural perspective? What does this activity tell us? And Cookie, you want to say something about the doll?
So the matryoshka, babushka, is a metaphor for obviously unpeeling the onion, right? As was also said. But when we when we start taking off the top of the matryoshka, we're going layer under another layer under another layer. So this was a visual metaphor that I saw. And it's again high context, but if you, while you're thinking about what your takeaways are, what also could you add your visual metaphors, if you have any thoughts of visual metaphors? Could be cultural or personal or whatever you think reflects your understanding.
Well, I'm going to stop sharing because I think Laura's comment is an important one to think about, right? So Laura, I think one part of the reason in terms of questions not asking is the broader notion, if you will, of those of us who grow up with a communication style that's direct, explicit, and linear. So for example, like I was talking about the social context when I came to the US, right? In the social context, if I were to ask me, tell me a little bit about yourself, right? And in the education context, say, oh yeah, this is what I'm studying, this is my major, and maybe, this is where I'm from, right? And whereas, and let's say out of, kindness, you turned around and asked me, tell me a little bit about yourself, I could potentially say from my cultural perspective, I could say, I was born on a full moon night when my grandmother was cooking rice in an earthen pot. And from there, I could go to a story when I was 9 years old, maybe when I was 25, come back to something else, which is much more indirect, circular, and so on. But the question is, and I think Cookie will get to it soon, is when I ask a question and you answer very directly in a few minutes, what are the values that come with it when we follow that format? Why is it that you only take a minute or two to introduce yourself? Right? Versus when I share a story, why am I sharing? I'm sharing because how can you understand me unless you know the context of the story from where I come from, right? So I feel it's very superficial if we just answer like, right? So cultural values are deeply embedded, if you will, in terms of the choices we make, right? And I think as Eric is talking about, questions may make it more difficult to build trust, right? Honestly, Cookie will say, the notion of contracting is very much a US Western or European Western concept, right? And Cookie said maybe an agreement is a better word, because the contract has values associated with it in terms of saying, this is what we have to get done. And in some way, formally, almost, you have to get it written. There's cultures where that's not the case.
More transactional, sorry.
Right. So
if I could just interrupt here a second, I liked what Wendy said at the beginning when we're introducing ourselves. Wendy mentioned, so if you don't mind, Wendy, I'm going to read it, or maybe actually, why don't you tell us?
Oh, okay. I'm trying to remember what I said.
Okay.
But I said that I'm zooming in from Minneapolis, Minnesota on Dakota homeland between two waterfalls, Oamni, which is St. Anthony Falls, and Minnegaga, which was translated as Minnehaha Falls. And then one thing about me, I have 19,000 hours of training in mindfulness and embodiment practice.
So here you're presenting yourself as part of your environment and your context of where you live and those who historically lived in your area, right? So you're part of their history and their story as well, or they're part of yours, either way.
Mhm.
Nice.
Right. Yes, Megan.
So when you said that you sometimes will share a brief personal story, will you do that I have two questions about that. Will you do that each session or just the first session? And do you do that before they tell you what they want to cover? Like, are you trying to relate to them once they say, here's my issue, or you do that to introduce yourself?
Initially, you're right, to introduce myself. And this actually I learned from a physician in New Mexico. And no other physician before or after has done this. When I met him for the first time, he asked me, I told him a little bit about yourself. And then he said, he had a picture of his family and he said, I want you to meet my family. Here's my, wife, here's my daughter, she's pregnant, she wants me to deliver her baby, but, I don't want to, I'm scared of delivering my daughter's baby. And then he said something, he said, when you come with an issue, I'm not sure which part of you and who you are is important. You will have to teach me to help you better, right? So the story part of it, Megan, is initially what I do is I actually share a story about my family and my background, but I do it briefly, not I was born on a full moon night, right? But I do pick up as a story in terms of what the client has said from the previous time, but I also share and self-disclose because for me, that vulnerability is equally important because I feel like it's not like I'm an expert with everything sorted out. And for me, it's also emotionally connect because as I think Wang said, and probably Damien will agree, coaching is not just about addressing an issue they bring, right? Coaching is the person and coaching is addressing the person and the issues and all of it come together. So I do it almost every session, but I do it naturally without feeling like it's contrived. Does that help, Megan? Does it answer your question?
Yes, that helps very much. Thank you so much.
Okay. So where are we? So Damien, is it okay if we take a quick 5-minute break, or was there a comment?
Perfect timing. Perfect timing for the 5-minute break. Cook, if that's okay with you too.
Yeah.
Okay. So
sorry, but Wendy, did you have a thought before we take a break?
Somebody?
Yeah. Oh, we can take. Yeah, I just had a question about the process of engaging in a coaching without questions and the role of authority, and because my experience was just almost exactly the opposite, was that it was much more directive, like. And I have a whole frame around that, around the difference between using language like tell me about, share with me, which is directive language. And it's claiming the role of my authority, which also is a cultural dynamic. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to talk about the complexity of how the communication style is also subtly communicating who's in control.
All right.
Absolutely. And thank you for saying that, because the path in terms, if you ask me, there's definitely also an issue of who's got the privilege and who's got the power and status, as you indicate, in terms of framing what you say, right? And that makes a big, like you said, makes it complex, but it's also real in terms of how the conversation happens, right? Take a 5-minute break, and if we could come back at 8:06, that would be great. Thank you. Just want to re-emphasize or emphasize that, what we did really is kind of just to get a sense of awareness around the possibilities, if you will, of, culturally adaptive coaching, which is to say, and we'll talk about this in a second, culturally adaptive coaching is taking both yourself as the coach and your culture into consideration and the client's culture. And when we say culture, it could be any number of different things, right? And so this is kind of a beginning or one way, because again, we're not saying don't ask questions, but I think they have a role, they have a function, they have values associated with it. The same is true of not asking questions, right? And there are implications in terms of conversations, as power is also mentioned, if you will, right? So broadly speaking, why do you think it's useful to explore or have culturally adaptive coaching? And of course, we haven't got into the nitty-gritty of all the definitions, but broadly speaking, why do you think it is important to look at or study culturally adaptive coaching?
Do you want to share your thoughts in the chat?
No, Cookie, may I request that we actually hear voices?
Okay,
If that's okay.
sure.
I'm being very direct and non-Indian.
That was very, very non-Naguesh there, but okay.
I know.
I'll throw myself in.
Please.
Whoa.
Thinking that we can coach in one way, one style all the time is probably a bit naive. And knowing that we're breaking geographic barriers an awful lot by being able to do what we're doing on the call right now. We have people from all over the world on this call. It means we can coach people from all over the world. But if we don't take the time to learn and understand each other's culture, we may miss each other during these coaching conversations in a pretty severe way. That may kind of break the coaching relationship. That'd be my take.
Thank you, Eric. Others? Thank you so much. Others? Tanny.
Yeah, I could add to it. It's funny, I did research at one point on cultural differences with individuals, and a lot of times you could insult somebody if you, use a certain tonality, if you use certain colors, if you use certain phrases and things like that. So I think it's really important to have your active listening and making sure that you're mirroring the person and meeting them where they are, but also be somewhat sensitive to the words that you're choosing to make sure that they wouldn't be anything that might be offensive. So there's a lot of interesting words that I came up with in the research that I found out if you say it, somebody's going to get just super insulted. So.
Right.
Right. Thank you so much, Lou. Yeah. Tanny first and then Laura.
Yeah, this has really been a very powerful demonstration to me about the relational part of coaching, that we're in service to them, and it's not. It's really clear. This has really been really enlightening for me to broaden my thinking about how I approach what they want, what they need. Meet them. Somebody said it earlier. Meet them where they are. And not to follow some checklist that is what I think is important and is what my need is to fulfill what I think coaching is, but to allow them some more ownership. I think that's what some of the questions are about, is to try to let them have some ownership, but maybe there's a gentler way to do that. A gentler way to, somebody said the notion of invite them to take the lead, invite them to tell me, what do you need? I'm not sure I could completely get rid of questions, but share with me, what makes this top of mind for you today? What's the reason that you bring this today? Instead of I really love the notion of building a relationship in a different way. And I will remember your story, Naguesh, about your doctor. But tell me what you need from me. Tell me how I can be of greatest service to you.
And you have to teach me as the patient.
I love that. I'll carry that with me.
Thank you. Laura?
I don't really remember the initial question you asked now, but what I was thinking was, I think before having this conversation, I might have felt like maybe there was, oh, this isn't a great match if I was working with someone from a different culture, right? Like, oh, I don't think this is a good fit, rather than thinking about what the culture differences might be and how I can meet that person where they're at and how I can adapt better, rather than being like, oh, I don't think it's a very good fit because we're from different cultures. So I think it opens my thinking a little about how to approach that without having that block of like, oh, it's just not a good fit.
Thank you so much, Laura. Right. And when we have the response, I think from our body, it's also telling us our own cultural orientation and values, right? In terms of fit or not fit and where we are. Right. So here are a few, and this work we've done in other forms, I think, and so on. But we put together a few ideas, if you will, of why is this important, right? So the first part of it, the moral responsibility, is to say, it's the right thing to do when you have cultural differences. And I would argue that every encounter in some way is intercultural, and intercultural meaning that we bring different aspects of our cultural identity to the conversation. And it's not a perfect, as they say, isomorphic match that, what I bring up in terms of what's important to my cultural identity is going to match the other person perfectly, right? Functional responsibility in terms of getting work done, I think it actually helps a lot. And there's quite a bit, as you know, from other contexts, that there is a profit responsibility for companies. I recently had a cousin come from Microsoft, very senior leader, right? And he's primarily talking about doing DI work, cultural adaptation, and so on. And the bottom line is, he says, if it's not going to impact my bottom line in terms of profit, it's not useful for me, right? And I think it's important to say all of them are important, right? And this gives a clearer understanding of diverse intercultural perspectives, different ways to think, different ways to behave, different ways to value, right? And we believe that it has the potential to have more profound and deeper outcomes, because during the break, Damien was again saying, right, when you have the notion of not asking questions or a combination that's culturally appropriate, it becomes not only just about the issue, but about the relationship and the person and persons, both of you involved, or the team involved, if you will, in the process. Optimizing organizational outcomes at the individual and team levels, enhances racial, social, and cultural awareness. There is, coming from India, in terms of privilege, I had great privilege in India, right? And this is not an unusual story. And not only did I go to ground zero when I came to the US, I felt like I'd gone -50 in terms of my privilege and what my skin color did. Right? Unfortunately or fortunately, that's one of the first things people see about me. And as the business impression management literature says, we tend to evaluate each other in the first minute in some fashion or another. Right? And the other part of the racial, social, cultural awareness, not here in the US, but in Europe, I've been in Netherlands recently doing quite a bit of work. Their conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, to some extent is about gender, but to some extent is about decolonization in terms of the roles, for example, Netherlands has played in different parts of the world. So it's important also, I feel like sometimes it can get US-centric very quickly. This is not necessarily true, like you said, in Japan or Brazil or in other parts of the world. I hope it brings increased business for the coach. If you're culturally adaptive and you're really doing it for different clients and doing it in a way that really it's connected, that it brings you more business because people are actually, the clients are very, very hopefully satisfied at multiple levels of addressing both professional issues, but also personal relationship beings, if you will, in the process. Right. Cookie?
So I think, I'm not sure if I can advance it.
No, I can do it.
Okay. So many of you know about the iceberg. It's a model that's used in many different contexts. I put this image together, this slide together, when I do intercultural coaching or training, because when we look at what's under the iceberg, the implicit part is, of course, these are the issues that we don't think about, we don't talk about, we don't look at, but they're very important. The history, the geography, the topography, the climate, all these impact our values, and also, of course, the beliefs, the traditions. develop what becomes our norms. So one more, Naguesh. Oops, okay. But then,
Sorry.
so in order to work from the explicit part, so when we're looking, this is what we see, we need to have a reference of what the why questions. Why are we doing what we're doing? When we look with those of you who know Maslow, he talks about his pyramid of needs, right? Those are the human universal needs. We all need the same things. Those everybody have, we all need food, we all need shelter, and the physiological part is the part where we need safety as well. When we go up towards behaviors and explicit, and we see what our behaviors are, we can also start thinking as to, so if each one of us is an iceberg, what is under the other person's iceberg that's driving them, right? And as we start to look at our backgrounds or our values or our assumptions, then it makes the judgment a little less harsh. And the whole purpose of this is to start engaging in the judgment, to be attentive to the judgment. Why are we judging? What is it that we don't know? Because we don't know what we don't know. So we need to ask those questions of why. When I want to talk about, oh, sorry. When I look at coaching as a question for the iceberg, what is the impact that the implicit has on your coachee, on your client, right? We look at empathy as one of the guiding forces of coaching. So we need to be aware of our own implicit just as much as we need to ask about the other's implicit.
Next slide, please. Yeah. So, this is again a beginning of our journey in terms of thinking about what is culturally adaptive coaching. And to talk about it, we just want to show you, and it's likely if you've traveled to India or Mexico City or Cairo, you'll see this. Take a look at this in terms of driving in India. And I'm just going to show about 30 seconds of it. Right. So, if let's say you had to tell a friend who's going to India for the first time, how to drive in India, what are some things you would tell this person?
Don't.
Sorry?
Don't.
Don't.
Be a passenger and be happy with it. Number 2, get used to the honking of the horns because they incessantly 24/7.
Right, honking of the horn and so on. But if you take this driving that you watch right now as a visual metaphor for coaching, what can you say? What do we learn?
The direction is uncertain and the lanes are just a suggestion.
Right, the lanes are just a suggestion. But if you take the movement of everybody, right, we have fewer accidents in India on an average than in the US. Right? So it feels like chaotic. Jerry?
I think one of the things for me is that what I picked up is there's a strong awareness of everyone else around. Whereas if you're driving in LA, it's you on the freeway and everybody else is sort of in the way. But in India, from that view, everyone's still kind of in their own space, but they're really aware of who's where, where's going where, who's crossing where. So there's a stronger awareness.
Thank you, Jerry. Right. I would say culture is lived, if you will. And so this is really what we call in a collective culture is my behavior is completely based on how others around me behave. Hierarchy matters. When the big trucks or lorries come, the smaller ones get out of the way. You have to give respect, if you will, right? And so literally it's a dance. It's not going to be the same thing every day, right? But if you take the same thing, and as Jerry was mentioning right now, right? Here is LA. Right? So go ahead, Cookie.
I took this picture many years ago. I like to take pictures from the air because it sort of reflects the cultural values, the environment of wherever I'm flying to. Now, LA, of course, is one of the most expansive cities there is. But why is this like this? If we look under the iceberg, you can see that it's very linear. There's a grid. And also the other interesting thing, if you ask the why, all this space was open space. So in the 1940s, when they started to build LA, they could expand. There were orange groves. But the other issue is the issue of the earthquakes. So I don't know if you can see it very well, but in the back here is downtown LA, which is now grown much larger. But there they have very strong, and as in most of the city, very strong seismic regulations, right? But it was just easier to expand. And this is a really good reflection of linear and a linear culture.
Right, and this is the values that it expresses and so on. So the part about this that we're getting to in terms of culturally adaptive coaching, yes, there's a definition and so on. But Cookie, you want to say a little bit about the last piece, which we think is an important piece?
So when I loved the video that Naguesh shared, because when I'm looking at that, I'm looking at rhythm, right? And so I coined this term called co-rhythming, which means you're sort of you're sort of finding the flow, and there's a fluidity. It's, as Naguesh said, it's a dance, but it's a co-dance. So there's a sense of listening, active listening, but also energy. And what is not said, silence is important. When we look at cultures, we're looking at the learned and shared values, of course. And this is the definition: learned and shared values, beliefs and behaviors among a group of interacting people. But where can we encounter those differences? So it's not only in coaching. If you start looking and becoming aware of what the importance of intercultural topics and intercultural experiences are, you'll find them not only globally and locally, but also, and of course, the question of diversity and equity and inclusion, which is important, but also in organizations and different departments. So the finance department has a different culture from the sales department, right? So when we're doing this coaching, we're kind of co-rhythming and sort of finding the flow together.
Thank you, right? And part of it, the reason I think of culture as a dance or rhythms, because at the end of the day, if you've grown up from a young age in this orientation, in terms of the rhythms that you have, right? That's deeply embedded in your cultural values versus what we saw in India in terms of adapting constantly. So I'm the youngest of 3 kids at home in India, and my brother and sister left at a young age internationally. And I didn't want to leave because I wanted to take care of my parents. And my parents finally said, get out. And so in some ways, if they're not said, get out, I don't think I would have left. And to some of my friends in the US, especially, they feel like, oh my God, why didn't you think about yourself? Yes, I'm thinking, but I have to think about my parents too, right? So if you take this, I'm going to...
One second, I have one quick comment about going back to the question issue. So are you looking at questions in a linear perspective, direct communication, or are you looking at the Indian traffic flow? How do you get around asking the questions?
Sorry,
so these are all metaphors.
Thank you. I saw a hand up. I'm sorry, is it? And I may have missed it. Did somebody have a hand up?
Oh, yeah, it was me a while ago. I'm sure like a lot of people here, if you drive in what we call like first world, sorry, those are very pejorative terms, driving is transactional. So it's very clear what you do and you stop here and you have the right of way and it's very, but in the developing world, it's a conversation. And I think, Naguesh, back to the point you were making about power, like a big truck is power. Somebody else made that point. And they're like, you have to know when you can ask questions and you have to know when you can't. You know, but if I could just offer one thing here.
Please.
I mean, so I'm an American. The definition of an American is someone who only speaks one language. So I'm not as cosmopolitan as a lot of people. But I found when I do work around the world, I just kind of put my cards on the table. You know, I'm from the US. Tell me about your culture here. And as long as you approach it with a sense of curiosity rather than arrogance, then people try to help you. That's way better than reading a book about what you do or don't do, because it's never that sort of black and white.
Thank you so much for saying that, Dave, because, you know, I often say that presence comes before presentation, meaning when you walk into a room and you're interacting with somebody, do we sense each other's energy before even we say a word? Right. So Dave, you're right. If you bring your presence, which seems to be open, curious, and humble, and I feel like that's something that we can sense relatively open easily, right? Then you're already setting, because it's true, like you said, just because, let's say, you're from a collective culture, think about each other, doesn't automatically mean we're respectful of each other. I mean, you know, one cultural lesson is that in our collective cultures, yeah, we're supposed to be polite to each other, but if you're thinking about hierarchy, a person superior to me can scold me, do all kinds of things and bully me without having any repercussions, right? So I think the presence and energy is an important part of it. And thank you for sharing that, Dave.
Naguesh, I'd like to make one point. I want to make it very clear that we're not talking about stereotypes here, right? This is very important. We're not talking about Americans are like this and Indians are like this and Chinese are like this, etc. That's not the way we do this. What we're talking about are cultural generalizations, because it's all technically all on a continuum, right? So there's also the issue of personality. And of course, now that's what Naguesh is going to get into, but I thought it's important not to understand that we're talking about that there are no stereotypes involved.
No, and I think it echoes what Dave was saying about the nuanced nature for each of us, right? I mean, one part of it is kind of what we bring from how we are brought up, and the other part of it is what we do with it when we actually interact. Cookie, I'm going to kind of, for the sake of time, where are we? Oops, where's this coming up? Go back.
Before Tori had her hand up, I don't know, Tori, if you still want to make a comment or say anything.
I think it would, and thank you. I think it was just in relation to what we were talking about inviting versus the questioning. And I just wanted to relate it back to another demo I think that you had posted on our base camp about where, you know, during the discussions there, along the mindset of we're there to meet the clients where they are and just creating the space. So I think it just echoes, I think, what other people were saying, but I was just wanted to share that I'm beginning to see the connections in multiple ways.
Thank you so much. Right. So one piece for, you know, I think Cookie and I is the piece that doesn't get talked about is what is the culture you bring to the conversation? Because when we talk about coaching, like I say here, we tend to be kind of outward focused, saying, how can I effectively, appropriately be a good coach, if you will, to a diverse group of clients, right? But it's true that you bring yourself, right? The inward piece in the health literature is called, they talk about cultural humility and cultural self-awareness, as we talk about, as a lifelong commitment to self-reflection and personal change, with the express purpose of serving others, right? Because the interaction is not one way. It is in a place where the coach and client or clients are working together. And for me, I think I like to use the infinity sign because I feel constantly in the interaction with your client, there's an inward piece of who you are, where you come from, and reflecting of that, and the outward piece of who's your client. They're not disjointed. They're connected constantly. And as Cookie was using the word flow a little while before, there has to be a flow, ideally, in culturally adaptive coaching. Because if you don't know yourself, and this is something a mentor told me a long time ago, if you don't know yourself, how can you be of service to others?
Mhm.
If you don't know your cultural orientation, values, etc., and where you're coming from, then how do you begin to understand somebody else, right? And so if we take this, the kind of bringing all this together, if you will, and like I said, we're just beginning to write, I'm beginning to write quite a bit around this in terms of culturally adaptive coaching. So what is it, right? And this is a starting definition that I've been working on now and offered in a few places, right? And please feel free to add, not just now, if you have feedback. I think of culturally adaptive coaching as when the coach consciously integrates their cultures and the client's cultures, if you will, to evoke powerful personal and professional outcomes for the client, right? Couple of pieces here for me, right? And I say culture, and I know we didn't get into it, is one piece of it is demographics in terms of nationality, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, right? Another piece in terms of, they talk about cultural dimensions in terms of orientation to time, etc., and so on. I would say there's a lot of recent literature about the way we think, cognitively, how we kind of frame ourselves, how we talk, how we manage conflict, also have cultural differences. So to be adaptive, I would say the appropriate cultures for the coach and client for that particular relationship, right? Understanding yourself, understanding what's important for the client. And I feel our role as coach to create the space to evoke, because we can't really, like, as we know, right? It's not dictating. We're trying to evoke powerful personal and professional outcomes for the client. But the interesting thing in this is it's not just about the client. I do strongly believe that it also has significant impact on the coach's personal and professional growth. And this happens only if you're self-reflective and reflexive. Meaning, I think as many of you are talking about, and I would say for all of us here together, right? Where am I coming from? What is this doing to me? Am I making mistakes? Am I learning? How am I projecting? But similarly, in terms of what am I offering, if you will, to the client in the process. So the journey and learning is not necessarily only one way when we do this. And so this, I'm sure you've been talking about it, those of you graduated and others too, is culturally adaptive coaching is systemic, intercultural, and intersectional, right? And just to talk about the last part, Cookie, you want to say a few words about these?
Yes. So what is the impact of our coaching in our coaching? We need to look at the different contexts. So number one, of course, we look at systems, family, team, department, organization. The culture is ethnicity, gender, organizational. But then also from a cultural perspective, what are the different dimensions of our communication style? So do we have a direct communication style or an indirect? I think Wendy mentioned this in the chat, low context or high context. So low context is using words, right? High context is other silence, nonverbal communication, and could be clothing also. How are you presenting yourself? Expressive and restrained is also a very important part of the picture. How are you expressing your thoughts? Are you being emotionally expressive, or are you have a more restrained approach? There's a whole conflict resolution style that is based on this. And then, of course, there's the intersectionality part, which is very important. But one of the proverbs that I like very much for Japanese, so this is for Tomo, is hear one and understand 10. So in a high context situation, you are hearing, you're listening to what people are saying, but you're listening also to what is not being said. And that's part of the information. So sometimes silence is negative, or there are facial expressions that can express, facial expressions that can define a certain emotion, right? So these are also important things to take into consideration.
So maybe most of you are familiar with the word intersectionality. It's come out of, to some extent, the work around diversity, equity, inclusion in the US. But the notion is that if you're somebody who is marginal or a deviant, as I was talking about, that it's not, right? So for example, if you have a patient, for example, and on the kind of, as they call it, SOP, in terms of writing down what it is 27-year-old, and let's say it says African-American male, then the focus tends to be only on African-American. And then it's kind of ignoring all the other parts of this person's identity that are extremely important. And that tends to happen if you're a person of privilege, looking at somebody who's not having the privilege, which is why minority cultures or marginalized cultures talk about intersectionality. But the word has benefit in terms of also, I think, what we bring and the client brings to the conversation, right? What aspects of us are important, how it comes together. Right? Thank you so much, Amy. She's actually put coin back. Yeah, thank you, right? She's very, very powerful, especially I think in the DEI context. Right? So, right, how can we be culturally adaptive coaches, right? So I hope this works. This is the second activity that we want to do with all of you. And this activity right now is called Mix and Match, right? I'm going to drop something in the link here, the chat here, that hopefully, if you click, opens up. I'm going to close this for a second and see if this helps. It doesn't want to do it. Okay. If you click this, you should get.
It opened up for me.
It is working. It is working, Naguesh.
Okay, good. So what you will see is, it went away. Are you seeing all the objects on the slide in front of you?
Yes.
It's not on the slide, but on the link.
No, when you click the link,
and when you open the link, you can see all
when
the
you open the
subjects.
link,
There's a room one.
Right.
Okay, right. So maybe let me do that so that I can also. Oops. Mine is loading. Mine is very slow, right? Have the objects kind of loaded on yours where you see multiple objects on your screen? Yeah. Okay, great.
Do you want me to share my screen, Naguesh?
Sure. If you could, that'll be great so that I can explain what we're going to do in pairs just for a few minutes.
Okay, so let me share that with everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, what you see here, right? I want to give credit, if you will, to Lily Seto, who actually has something called Magic Box. So that Magic Box is kind of what inspired me to think about this. You see objects on this, right? And there's a room number, if you will, and we're going to put you in pairs. And now the person who was the coach becomes the client, and the person who was the client becomes the coach. And you'll find this to be hopefully an easier exercise, right? And once you're in your room, go to the room that's the room number related to you, and the way you can go to your room is at the top, right? Damien, if you click at the top, there should be 1/20, so it should go from one room to the next.
I'm not sure how do you do that? From here,
yeah, right there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that way, each pair will have your own set of objects. They're the same set of objects, right? So in this case, the person who is a coach was a client. Let's say you bring an issue that's important to you. What you're going to do as a client and the coach, you're going to ask and say, organize, choose the objects which are relevant to the issue that you're bringing and group them together to tell your story in terms of what the issue or concern or opportunity is, right? And Damien, I think you're beginning to do that. Is like exactly right. If let's say you pull the ace of spades and the fish and the spoon in a certain formation, you don't have to use all the objects, right? And the coach invites the client to put it together and then share her or his story based on that. And then having the coach then using the story as a prompt to learn more about what's going on, right? So the idea is you have the same set of objects, but you're giving the freedom, if you will. Eric, when you go into your rooms, yeah, will the room number show, Damien, when they go into pairs?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so based on your room number, if at the top you'll see 1 through 20, so go to your room number. So each room for your pair, you'll have to play around with it, right? And if you can't play around, technically that's fine, but you can kind of get the idea. But if you could play for a few minutes. Client, think of an issue you're bringing. Coach, you're asking the client to say, use these objects in any way to put together to tell your story in a few minutes. Any questions or comments or thoughts?
We'll type it into the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes because we have 15 minutes to finish. So that will take 10 minutes and then 5 minutes to wrap up. It's okay with you?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to open the rooms for 10 minutes.
Thank you.
So we have a few minutes left. So as one of my mentors would ask, what stood out in this exercise for you? What stood out in this exercise for you? And please, if you could share and talk, say a few words.
I'll share. I thought it was a really fun and creative way to get people talking. And I was in the room with Martin. She had a really beautiful way to pull these objects together to explain some of her challenges and also to highlight where she wanted to be. Martin, I hope you don't mind I share this piece, but she said, I really love the balloon so I could like fly away, float away, sort of expressing a desire for freedom.
No, thank you, Ashley.
It's neat.
Sorry?
I really love the creativity part of this. It was engaging.
No, thank you. And like you said, the second piece we didn't talk about is exactly what I've done in a coaching session is to say, okay, now organize the objects to tell me what you would like it to look like, right? So others, thank you, Ashley. What stood out for you?
I was a client.
Yeah.
Christina, I was the client, and so I got to pick the pictures, and in some ways that was easier probably than or helping me organize my thoughts to talk about it. Instead of just diving into what the problem was, it was maybe easier picking out those objects on how I was feeling about that, and then explaining that through the objects to the coach.
Thank you so much, right? So you can use the indirect way to talk about challenging things in some ways, right? Because it's there. Tori?
Yeah, I think I acknowledged, so I was in the coach seat, but acknowledged that I was looking at some of these items in a very different way than the client, the person that I was working with was. And had just very different initial reactions or definitions or meaning to each of the items. And as I asked questions and dug a little deeper into really what my partner, meant by all of this, it was really just kind of eye-opening to think about the different versions of the same exact item that we were looking at that meant different things to her.
Thank you. It's a really powerful statement you're making, Tori. And that's the reason why it's the same objects for everybody, right? and how we can shape reality very differently based on how we see it, right? Quickly, this is an activity where, one you can do online, but also you can have fun creating it, putting objects together. I also do it live, so I love going to a dollar store and picking out things that I can put in packets for different participants or clients. Initially, I was a little worried, honestly, whether corporate clients would like it. I find that actually very senior leaders love to play, and they rarely get a chance to play. And so using this has been interesting to see my senior corporate leaders actually play with it and say, creating these stories and talking about emotions like, was talked about, right? I want to be thought, go ahead, sorry.
Just interrupt a second. You can also use Legos. So I do debriefs with Legos. I've designed a spaghetti village where you build a whole village with spaghetti with groups. And there are many, many different ways of doing it. You just have to be creative and see what the intent is and what you want to get out of it, and start from one piece and then look at the end of it, the outcomes as well.
Any final comments overall before, and I want to be respectful of the time. We're already 1 minute past.
Running out of time, so we need to start wrapping up.
Thank you. Wendy's comment actually is about how curious how to apply this. One part of it, I think, is an important question to say, is this actually useful, culturally appropriate for the client? And it may not be, right? So the part about this is not all of them will fit to say if it works, if this is, and maybe Wendy, I'm curious in terms of, are there objects they would be actually excited to talk about if that was placed in front of them versus these objects? But if metaphors and stories don't work, you're right. I don't think we should be using stories and metaphors. I think you should be adapting in terms of what the appropriate style is. Yeah. Thank you again, Damien, and all, our honor. And in fact, I was telling Damien is going to share the PPT with you. If you have any, we would love your feedback. Like I said, this is a journey that we're just beginning to take in some ways. We hope there is some value. So do tell us if there's some value, and your feedback on saying how we can continue refining it as we move forward.
Thank you very much. Let's thank Naguesh and Cookie for this great space for reflection. And if you want to write something to them briefly, like some feedback, I am sure they will appreciate any comments about this session. That will be great. Just one sentence or two, if you want to. And I wish to reinforce the idea of awareness. So this goal is not only about doing, but it's about being. It's about being how we are showing up as coaches. It's not about doing it perfectly, but it's about how we are curious. But we were talking before, David, you're bringing that about traveling and how we're interested, how we're curious, and how we connect. It's about connection and exploring together what do we need to have a foundation for the relationship. Because at the end of the day, this is the most important, is the relationship, is how you build trust. We're going to have a session on trust coming up in 2 weeks. So we're going to keep exploring how to work on the foundation of the coaching-client relationship. So thanks everybody. For the participants of the program, if you can stay just 2 minutes, I want to give you direction for next week. So you have your first group mentor coaching session. For everybody else, thank you. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Naguesh, Cookie, for supporting this program for all of these years. And
thank you so much.
I hope that to have you back soon, so we can keep learning together.
Happy to.
If I can just add the last word,
Yes.
I want everybody to remember that this is just the beginning. It's developing awareness. This is a process and it takes time, curiosity, and courage. And just let go and go for it.
Thank you, Cookie, and thank you, Naguesh.
Bye. Thank you.
Ciao.